What is up, everyone? Welcome to Over Your Shoulder. Just like the name, that's what we'll be doing. Today we're going to be looking over Mark Carolan's shoulder and diving into his front of house rig from the last tour he was on. Mark is a TPI award-winning engineer who has not only been nominated for the TPI 10 times, but he is also a Parnelli Award nominee. He currently tours with Muse and has toured with the likes of The Cure, Snow Patrol, and No Party for Cowdong. In addition to touring, he also co-owns Black Mountain Studios in Ireland with his partner Peter Baldwin. So let's see what he's got going on. What's up, Mark? How you doing?
Hey, Drew, how's it going, man? You all right?
Yes, I'm great. How are you?
I'm in quarantine.
Well, that's a good sign. Thanks for doing this thing with me today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Yeah. So you're in quarantine? What are you up to?
I'm in Taipei. I think I'm in day 4 or day 5 of quarantine here. I've come over to work with the Taiwanese act called No Party for Cowdong, who are a big Taiwanese rock act. You know, they've been doing some international stuff too. It's bizarre. They seen a news show at Rock in Rio that they were playing at too, and the COVID-19 world that we live in here, I am. It's quite cool to get an opportunity to do something as bananas as this. So yeah.
So just so we're all clear, does that mean you're actually going to hear a PA and speakers and like we used to do it?
Yeah, I'm going to mix in the Soul Led Arena, which. I'm actually kind of apprehensive about, because I think we've all got some element of PTSD, and the idea of being in close quarters with 15,000 people again is bizarre.
Let's kick this off. I'm really excited. I'm really excited to dig into this because I've heard a lot of complimentary things about the way you mix, and I've always wanted to kind of learn more from you. How old were you when you started in the industry?
I had a kind of an odd path to where I ended up. So as a kid, I studied classical violin, did my grade 8 when I was 12, and then jumped that to go play in a punk rock band. And then when I was 18, I went to college in Dublin. I'm from a town called Dundalk, which is right on the border between North and South Ireland, right in between Dublin and Belfast. Yeah, when I was 19, it was like move to the big city, move to Dublin. In my first year there, I bumped into an old friend from home who had just started running a really cool kind of underground gig, and had also hooked up with some other people who bought some recording equipment. And nobody knew how to operate the stuff. So I bumped into him at this cool gig, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come and help us out with this thing?" So I did. And then pretty soon we were running this really cool independent label, and we had a really cool 8-track studio, and all the kind of, it suddenly became this really, really cool underground scene. And then that kind of led to a trip over to England here, a trip over there. It was an Irish act called JJ72 that I kind of produced. The thing that always happened to Irish producers or engineers at the time was, as soon as the band that you were nurturing or the artist you were nurturing got to a certain point, it was immediately, okay, well, let's go and get an American in, or let's go and get an English person in. They would never bring it to fruition with the homegrown talent. It was the old Irish story of go abroad to, ply your wares. Yeah, so JJ72, I spent, between them, a band called The Thrills, and some other Irish acts, I spent years and years and years doing every toilet in England, every, 3 people in a 20 capacity room, years and years of that in the back of the van. I mean, I know there's American versions of this, but it's particularly grim when you do it in English weather.
Yeah.
Years of that. And then JJ72 opened for Muse, and
on
a European tour. And the guy who was mixing Muse at the time, I don't know if you remember back in those days, where nobody really carried their kit at that level, So Muse were doing kind of big clubs, small theaters kind of thing.
Okay.
So it was kind of desk du jour every day, and there was no console for the opener. So you were always at the mercy of what was the headline guy going to give you. I did tours with some guys who were really cool, and they'd give you a bunch of channels and whatever. But on Muse, I remember one show where he gave me 5 channels.
Oh, no.
5. But I used to just take that as a challenge every day. It's like, well, fuck you. I'm gonna make my 3-piece and can definitely not play as well as Muse. I'm gonna just try to make them sound better than Muse. And that's what I did every night. I went out and I had a kind of well, fuck you. I'm gonna do this kind of attitude to it. By the end of that tour, Muse offered me the gig. So
You were working with the support.
Yeah.
That's a really cool story of like how you got in with Muse.
But because I was still working with JJ72, and I wanted to see out what we'd started, so I had to say to Muse, well, yeah, I'd love to do it, but I can't do this show, I can't do Lowlands, I can't do this, I can't do that because I've got prior commitments. They were like, okay, cool, we'll just get some other people who should do that. At the time, I had zero profile. I was working for small Irish acts. So they got, the guy who makes Prodigy, the guy who makes the race, all these heavy hitters. And the shows I wasn't doing, I was like, oh, look, I've completely blown this. But for whatever reasons, they stuck with me.
Oh, that's awesome.
That is years later.
How many years?
It's actually, I think it's coming up to 20 years this year.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a pretty special thing when you have that long of a rapport with an artist. That kind of leads me into the next question. As a live sound engineer, as a front of house engineer, who is your inspiration as an engineer? Do you have one, or did you kind of get swept up so fast that you didn't really have? You were like, oh, I'm just going to start doing shows.
I was so into U2, and Joe O'Herlihy was definitely my first kind of totemic heroic guy. I remember, I think it was around the time the Joshua Tree, the Irish national broadcaster, did this kind of news documentary on the Joshua Tree tour. This is the original Joshua Tree tour, and there was an interview with Joe, and I just remember being like, he had just a brilliant vibe about him and a buzz to him that he was my first kind of inspiration for sure.
Awesome. Okay. Do you have a
and still is.
Yeah.
He's such a dude. Yeah.
Awesome. Have you got to meet him?
Actually on the U2 360 tour, because both Snow Patrol and Muse opened for them. I think I did about 60 shows on the U2 360 tour. I was part of the furniture,
Yeah.
They were such nice people to be around, that whole camp.
Okay.
Fantastic people, yeah. So that was a great experience. Yeah.
What would be the best show that you've seen that you didn't mix? Because this is one of the reasons I kind of feel like I've been very excited about this episode, is because I asked that question to a lot of people, a lot of engineers, and a lot of them, like I've covered Paul, and some people were saying Beck, and then I've also heard Muse a lot. And a lot of people say your show is a fantastic sounding show. So I want to flip the question back on you and see if what was a fantastic sounding show that you just remember in your head as being one of the best shows you've heard.
There's a couple of shows that definitely stick in my memory. But if you were to go at it in a purely technical way, that's not really how I remember shows that the mix stayed with me. So it'd be like U2 at Slane Castle was just because of the vibe of what it was and the energy and how that all moved, just fantastic. And then, like that, I remember the first kind of large scale outdoor VDOS show that I did, which was Dave Bracey mixing Robbie Williams. And that was the first time I heard, that was the first time I heard line array deployed outdoors with a fantastic engineer. But, that was the time when so you had a fantastic engineer with a fantastic system, that stuck around. And then recently I went to see Coldplay at Croke Park. And Dan Green, back when I was doing JJ72, I came across Dan when he was mixing Coldplay. He's a similar thing, he's studio background. And I went to go hear them at Croke Park. And Croke Park in Dublin, it's a Gaelic football stadium, which is an order of magnitude bigger than a soccer stadium. It's a notoriously horrendous sounding stadium. It's a really difficult place to get a by.
Okay.
He absolutely knocked it out of the park.
Dan Green for Coldplay.
Yeah, Dan Green for Coldplay. They're the types of shows that always stick with me. It's like the energy, the vibe, the atmosphere, as opposed to things that are overtly technical. That's what I get off on,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes total sense. I mean, based on our phone call previous to this, and I can't wait to get into some of the parts of energy that you add to the show. So before we jump into the gear section, I have one question I feel like we should talk about before we get into the rack. When we were talking, we were discussing your automation that you were kind of building into your show and the three specific layers. Could you kind of share your mentality on your automation for the show? for Muse?
Yeah. One way to look at it is like, if you look at it from a studio perspective, say, you've got kind of three disciplines. You've got a recording engineer, you've got a mix engineer, you've got a producer. And essentially, I've kind of, weirdly, when I thought about it, that's what I was doing with the layers. So I've got kind of an input layer, and that's where I'm being the sound engineer, for want of a better word. Then I've got the kind of automation layer, and that's like me being the mix engineer. And then the top layer, which is kind of just free and it's open, is almost like the producer's layer, So it's one way to think about it. So essentially, what's happening is on the inputs, it's essentially what are the inputs coming in, how do they sound, gain structure, etc., etc. And then any summations of things happen there as well. So, for instance, I quite like to fold things down. A simple example, 2 snare microphones, snare top, snare bottom. I like to make that blend, fold them together, make that sound decision and move on. And then it's a snare from that point on.
Okay.
So, like Tom's individual sounds, make the decision on the balance, make the decision on the sounds, fold them together, toms, underheads, etc., etc., etc. So anything that's, any source that's a multiple of things gets folded together, and then that becomes its thing. Then we move up to the automation layer, which is where I need to do either specific relative automation moves or absolute automation moves. And this goes back to kind of my studio days. I always preferred to mix on SSL and the idea of absolute and relative. And so I've always carried that thinking forward. So in the automation layer, then that's where a lot of that chopping and moving and whatever. I can automate anything, from fader to mute, obviously that simple stuff, or specific EQs or compressions or inserts in or out, or, whatever automation calls for happens on that layer. And then I try to have a top layer where my hands are on faders that aren't really jumping around too much, and I can keep my head up and I can watch the show and I can react to the show and feel the audience and react to that. And that's where I like to stay.
Okay.
So I'm trying to kind of make decisions and move on so that when you get to the point of doing the show, you can concentrate on exactly what's happening in front of you. And you're not trying to make all these decisions or, where you're trying to hit super precise cues that sapping your concentration, your where your head's at into these hyper specific things that you should have made a decision on, you should have moved on from. And staying in the moment of the song or the performance of the audience that's around you, of what's in front of you, So say, for instance, with when I talked about combining kicks or snare. So what I like to do with that is I like to just, we call that a snare bus, and that goes out, hits the DBX 160, and that comes back into its own channel called the snare. And then, so on that channel that's called the snare, all the decisions about that snare have been made. And I can still tweak it if I want, but that's my starting snare. The automation would have happened in the middle layer in between that. So in this instance of a snare, it combines, it goes out, it hits the 160, and when it comes back, it comes to a middle layer of snare, which is an automation, which is either pulling it up and down in level, that's already been compressed. And then I've got the snare fader that I do the show on, which can be relative to any of those moves. I mean, that's only specifically for the snare. With other types of inputs, you might want to do that around, or change where the compressor is in that point, or gating it, or what's the best methodology for that point. But it follows the same logic in the structure.
I kind of really have to bring this up because I thought this was really fascinating in our phone call. You said something about automating mic pre's. You want to talk about this dangerous thing that you're doing live and inspire a bunch of engineers to do some reckless stuff?
Yeah. So on the new simulation series setup, because I used an XL4 previous to that because I really like the pre's, and I might just do this. It's like an 8-channel XL4 pre strip with some. And it has the killer for me is it has the filters. Is it exactly as good as the best XL4 you'll find? Probably not, but it's close enough for me. And I have it sitting across my meter bridge like an XL4, and the gains are there. I realized that all those inputs were also double patched into the Avid stage racks because the monitor guy wasn't using that system. And I thought, oh, hang on, using the automation, I could either momentarily or automate within a song, I can jump the pre's. So I can either choose the flavor of the XL4 pre's or the Avid pre's, and the new pre's on the SXL are really, really good as well. And they're a different flavor to the XL4 pre's. So I kind of thought, well, I'm just doing stuff for the sake of it here. But then actually there was 2 songs in the set where I went, no, actually for the drum approach that will work. And so I did. I was automating between things. Now, obviously that's a different situation to being in a show that's put together to tour for 2 years and everything's specifically built for it. Would I recommend doing that on a turn up at a festival, third in the bill? No. No.
Yeah, don't try this at home, kids. I would love to hear just that difference too. Like it would be fantastic.
I don't know if I did it just for the exercise, but I could hear it.
Yeah. A show is a series of all these little tiny changes, and I mean, if you had some,
I'm a big believer in because if you follow the logic of, well, the audience can't hear the difference, I don't buy into that at all. The audience on an emotional level are reacting to all this stuff,
Yeah.
For sure.
The last question I have regarding your automation is the way that you fire your scenes. You'd mentioned something about using velocity as a way to map out a song. Can you explain a little bit about your mentality with how you do this? I thought this was a brilliant idea of how you do your automation.
It was, the necessity being the mother of the invention kind of a moment. So when I had my XL4 Pro 2C setup, which was actually quite heavily automated, a lot of people may have seen the XL4 and gone, oh, it's an analog purist. And the word was purist, by the way.
Purist.
But in fact, that setup was quite automated. There's quite a lot of things going on. But the Pro 2C had no way of dealing with timecode or dealing with timecode in the way I wanted it to deal with timecode. So I ended up doing a system where, let's just say Hysteria is the first song. So I would say, okay, Hysteria's note is C1. Okay, so Hysteria is C1. Bar 1 of Hysteria is C1 velocity 1. Bar 2 of Hysteria is C1 velocity 2. Bar 110 of I don't know how long Hysteria is, but is C1 velocity 110. And so we would just create this really simple, just like, each bar just like that, like super easy to program. You could think about the song in a musical sense from that point forward, which made, coming from a classical music background in some ways, just made way more sense to my brain than pure LTC, which I totally understand as well. But the huge advantage in that system is that if the artists decide to change the tempo of the song, or you decide to do a one-off radio edit version for, Saturday Night Live or whatever, they got to chop something out. My automation would, I didn't have to go and reprogram anything because it was all programmed from the point of view of the song, not the abstract of the time of the song, but the music sense of the song.
That's crazy.
Obviously, when I moved to the S6L, obviously, its functionality when it comes to timecode is, it's current, it's modern, it's, you can do whatever you want with it. But I kept the legacy system because it worked, and it still pays off for me every now and again, in rehearsals. Because what I love about Muse is, all they care about is the feel of what they're doing, and if there's huge technical ramifications in that change, so be it. Music comes first, and, how you deal with that, you deal with it. If they decide, which can happen in rehearsals, we'll bump that up half a BPM. Now, if you'd already done all your programming and they just kind of went, okay, bump it up half a BPM, that is a lot, if you've got 20 or 30 cue points in the song, that's a lot of refiguring out and remapping. Whereas with that system, it's like, okay, literally changed nothing for me, I would have to re-enter the BPM for delays.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to start jumping into your racks here. I'm guessing this rack is house left, right? Is that right? And it kind of wraps around.
I've always had the same kind of, that when I look around, it's the same bunch of stuff. This was, so it was the same way in my XL4 setups all the way back, since I was allowed to carry stuff. I always have people saying that I know I lock there, that's my vocal stuff. I lock there, that's my drum stuff. I lock there, that's my basic guitar stuff, and my effects are generally there. I don't like using the word OCD because it's not OCD. It's just I'm fussy. Position of things and where things are. Again, it goes back to the whole idea of one less thing to think about, So I know that I look where that's where that element will be, or that's where the vocal thing will be. So if we're talking about DBX 160A, that's there.
Yeah, that's there. All right. Yeah. So at the top of the rack, we got, looks like a little remnants from your Midas days. It looks like an XL42 channel strip, I'm assuming. Yeah. What does this guy do? What are you using this for?
That's kick and snare.
Kick and snare.
Kick and snare, yeah.
And this is a 2-channel guy, right?
Yeah. So one is the kick, one is the snare.
Got it.
These will be remember we talked about the idea where things get combined. That's generally what's happening with any of the inserts. This is where they're meshing together.
Okay.
So you'll see that there's 2 160s and an XL42. So that's kick XL42 with a 160, snare XL42 with a 160. The reason the XL4 is there, XL42 is there, it's something that I just know is going to work in my kicks and snares.
Okay.
From the point of view of the EQ. And I can kind of add in even more of that drive there if I want or not. I tend to, once I've got the gain structure how I want it, we'll photograph it, we'll mark it out, and it won't change for the rest of the tour. Once it's working, it stays locked. The kick snare have the DBX 160A and also have the SBL Transient Designers on them as well.
Okay.
Transient Designers generally are not adding any attack. What I do with kick drums, especially acoustic kick drums, is take a lot of the sustain out. I think it's information that you don't need in arenas or stadiums. You just don't need it. A long decaying kick drum is a pointless thing to have in a large arena. I mean, big 808 drop is a different thing to the super long parts of the kick drum decay. Rich Costey actually has such a great word for this kind of thing. He calls it the dark matter. Rich Costey he's produced and engineered most of his big albums, and he did Fiona Apple. He was, he did a lot of. He's done a lot of fantastic stuff.
He did Win the Pawn, right?
He did that. Yeah, he mixed that. Yeah, such a good sounding record.
Yeah.
Again, he's definitely one of my inspirations over the year, because he's out of these little gems every now and again, and which you go, oh. And so he has this phrase "dark matter" that I've really taken to heart with especially filtering.
Okay.
What do you really need? Do you really need all that flab? Kind of, your kick drum's got to do this thing, and does it? In the context of the song and the music and the actual experience the audience is having, is it really? Or is it just adding this dark matter that you can't really hear, but it's just down there going,
Yeah.
So what the Transient Designer is doing generally with the kick drum is it's taking out the dark matter and turns it to kick. There's the same thing. So as a Transient Designer, it's adding just a touch of sustain, just a touch, and sometimes just a hint of attack. But it's shavings. It really is shavings.
Yeah, it doesn't look like you're doing too much except for the kicks sustain. Just dumped.
Yeah.
All right. So for the clarification for people watching, your kick and snare buses are coming into these XL42 EQs. Then it's getting compressed by the 160A, and then it's fed into these Transient Designer channels. Is that the sequence of?
That sequence, yeah.
I love that. That's definitely a unique approach to that. I'd never thought of the dark matter being something to suck out.
It's strange when you start to think about it. Is how much of your engineering is actually you fighting the dark matter?
Yeah.
It's there. You're not really perceiving that it's there, but that's what you're fighting.
Okay.
And if you think about the summation of all that as well across all of your inputs, that's where it gets really, really interesting. So it's kind of, the tidier you are, the bigger the payoff.
I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we jump into what it looks like another XL42 channel strip. Is this a stereo-based group, or are you just using one channel on this?
Okay, sorry. There's one thing. There's a Transient Designer in the Toms group, but you can see how minimal that is as well. It's just doing a little bit of sustain, a tiny bit of attack. The next XL42. So one of the things with Muse is we have kind of 3 bass overall channels going on, if you want to call it that. Well, we've got it. We call it bass clean, and there's a DI and a mic of that. So again, the same idea of we've combined them. They go into that XL42, and then they're compressed by that tube tech below, which is a single channel. And then the other side of that is that ended up becoming blank, and it ended up becoming a spare of that insert, just in case I needed to pop that over. And it's in transit around the world all the time. mean, the tube techs have been fantastic, don't get me wrong, but that would just sit there just in case. With a lot of my redundancy, I would have a plugin waiting to take over any of this stuff.
Okay.
And momentary snapshots, I had it set up so that, if anything failed, it's just like bang, there was an equivalent game plugin that could come in and do that job of the unit that failed.
Okay. It looks like we got to talk about this tube tech, the LCA2B, is it? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, ATV. Yeah, I've been using them for a long time.
So what draws you to this particular compressor?
It's got a sound. You can be transparent with it, or you can be, you can really get colorful with it. And it's got these preset modes. Sometimes with a unit, you don't really want to think about it. That's why I love the DBX 160As, is because they sound good for me on kicks and snares. And they've got a threshold and a ratio. And I do the thing until that's, there's the gain reduction I want. And that's it. In the live domain, have something that you can just pull a threshold in. But as you can see with the, with the bass, I ended up going back to a manual attack release thing. But with the guitars, they're on a preset, and it's always preset too. And it's got it, and that gives me exactly the time domain I want and the coloration I want. I can just move on. It's got good metering as well. It's got good accurate metering, and it's just, it's a handmade Danish unit. It's just, it's beautiful.
So since you're in kind of a manual approach with this tube tech, can you kind of explain what your approach is? Are you doing like a fast attack, fast release, or are you doing a slow attack, like fast release, or what kind of ratios? It looks like you're at 3-to-1, I guess, if you were to.
And actually, with both the bass and guitar on Muse, the compression is quite minimal. A lot of my compression is quite minimal. It's just tickling because they're giving me excellent dynamic and excellent music control. So I shouldn't be overly clamping that down. So a lot of what I try to do is make sure that the intention is getting across. You know what I mean?
Of course. Yeah, and you can't suffocate the performance. You can't go too hard on one thing.
Exactly. So with the guitars, we used to have, we had the tube heads and multiple cabs. Well, actually, we single cab, and then we shifted everything to Kempers, but I kept a lot of the same signal chain.
Yeah.
Because the models that they did on the Kempers with Tommaso, who is Matt's studio engineer, they did these awesome models of Matt's gear with Matt's pre's with our live ribbons that we were using. So the emulation was absolutely fantastic. So I was able to keep the exact same signal chain, the same approach, because it was the same.
Well, that's awesome. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the bass group, your bass group for your inputs of your bass. So at the end of this, it looks like you have a 901.
Yeah, that ended up getting binned. I used to use a lot of 901s. This rack layout is from the start of the tour, so I will try to point out some changes that we made. A lot of the 901s ended up getting replaced by the Mac DSP. Is it the AE600? Mac DSP were the first ones to do really good digital dynamic EQ.
Okay.
There's lots of multi-bands out there, but not a lot of people were doing a good dynamic EQ. That finally was the one that got me to move away from having so many 901s. What essentially that's doing is, it's sometimes, because Chris plays with his fingers, every so often you would just get a little stray, twack of the string off the pickup, or something like that. So I would just try and just control that out, and then it would also give me, you can see like I've got a kind of 80 hertz shelf happening there that maybe in a festival situation you need to kind of get something under control specifically for noise restriction reasons or whatever. I had that there ready to just punch in if I needed it. So that's all that ended up doing. That Cush audio ended up moving.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so then we jump down to your Fatso Junior. Is that on the bass group, or is that?
No. So that is guitar. So you can see guitar A and B. That's essentially left, right of the Kempers. It's not actually strictly left, right. Matt had this really cool way of doing this where it was just the models would be slightly different. It obviously this depends. There's so many different ways presets go with Matt's guitar sound. But a really cool thing he would do is he would use a slightly different model on the left and the right. It would still be a very direct down the middle guitar sound, but it also had this stereoism to it. The Fatso and TubeTech are simply a stereo of that. And again, it's the same thing with the Fatso. It's just it's there to do hyper extreme stuff, because some of his presets can be, raw DI of, with fuzz factories and a lot of stuff that's got crazy content in it. And it allows me to keep that content, not filter that content out, but present it in a way that's not fatiguing over time for the audience. This is a theme that will come up again and again, is about audience fatigue.
So, and then this is the process. You're hitting the Fatso first, and then you hit the TubeTech, the LCA2B.
The other way around.
Oh, okay. You're controlling a little bit of the dynamics, and then you're hitting the Fatso with kind of like a more compressed sound. Is that kind of the vibe?
Yeah. It's when I say compressed, I mean the maximum you'll see on that. I mean it's generally tickling to like 1.5 dB of compression.
Okay.
In extreme situations, it's going to. Well, there are some very extreme cases, but maybe 3, maybe 4 dB of compression. It's small, but when you get that tickle point right, it does make all the difference. When it's hitting the Fatso again, it's just calming down that. I don't like to use the word calming down, but it's all that super high energy that can get spurious and can get fatiguing. It's just kind of smoothing that off, saturating that out a little bit. Oh, the other thing that's happening with the guitar within the S6L then is there's also a dynamic EQ for, some specific points. So I know there's going to be a real intense feedback squeal around 2K. How you perceive something on a set of in-ears is different to how you perceive something that's coming through a stadium versus PA, Yeah. So again, it's keep the intention, but don't kill your audience, So there will be some dynamic EQs in there that are just, keeping an eye on housekeeping.
Which dynamic EQ are you using for the guitars?
So I'm using the Mac DSP A600.
That's your 901 replacement?
My 901. Yeah, I thought I'd never get rid of the 901. It broke Scan's heart, replacing them, trying to source new ones, fixing them, because they don't make them anymore, especially.
That concludes part 1 with Mark. So please tune in next week for the conclusion of episode 3. I want to thank Mark for coming on and sharing his time and his knowledge with all of us. If you dug this video, please like, please share, and please subscribe. Until next time, take care and be safe.